Think back to high school science class for a second. Can you almost smell the Bunsen burners, hear the clinking of beakers? For generations, that physical lab was the place where science happened, right? But that's all changing, and fast. There's this huge wave of new tech that's completely transforming education. So today, we're going to dig into the rise of the virtual lab, and you'll see its impact is pretty surprising.
And this all leads to a pretty big, maybe even provocative question. With things like virtual reality and these super powerful simulations getting cheaper and easier to access, is the good old-fashioned science lab totally obsolete? I mean, that's a huge question. So let's stop guessing and actually dig into the data to see what's really going on.
All right, here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at what the new science classroom even looks like. Then, the big one. Do these virtual labs actually work? We'll check out the data. After that, we're going beyond just test scores to see the real impact. And yeah, some of the downsides. Finally, we'll wrap it all up and think about what this means for the future of, well, experimenting itself.
Okay, so first up, let's set the stage. We're talking about how the modern science classroom is being, completely reimagined by all this new technology.
And this quote, it just nails the shift that's happening. The traditional science laboratory is no longer the only gateway to meaningful experimentation and discovery. And listen, the key word there isn't replacement, it's about expansion. Technology isn't kicking the old lab out, it's just opening up a bunch of brand new doors for how we discover things.
Okay, that all sounds great in theory, but here's the million-dollar question. Do these virtual labs actually work? Let's cut through the hype and look at some cold, hard evidence. So, the evidence we're going to look at comes from this really interesting study. They took 50 high school seniors, grade 12 learners, and split them into two groups. The topic was impulse and momentum. Pretty complex physics stuff. One group did it the old school way, with a hands-on lab. The other group, they used a virtual lab. The goal was super simple. Which group was going to learn it better?
And honestly, the results were kind of shocking. The group in the traditional lab, they scored an average of 60% on the test afterward. Not bad. But the virtual lab group, they averaged 80%. I mean, that's not just a little bump, that's a huge 20-point jump. It's a massive difference.
And here's another way to look at it that really drives the point home. A full 80% of the students in that virtual lab group passed the test. So this wasn't just a case of the top students doing a little better. This was about lifting up the entire group, helping way more people succeed.
But look, better test scores are only part of the story, right? To really get what's going on, we have to dig into the why. What is it about these virtual labs that makes them so darn effective?
Well, the research points to a whole bunch of reasons. For one, students don't just learn more, they actually remember it better. They're more motivated, more engaged. And think about it, the environment is totally safe. No worries about hazardous chemicals or breaking expensive glass. Plus, they're super flexible, and they really help build up those practical and critical thinking skills.
But maybe the biggest win of all is what's called deeper conceptual understanding. This is where the magic really happens. Virtual labs let students see the invisible. Seriously, things like magnetic fields or watching molecules actually form chemical bonds in real time. It takes these really abstract ideas and makes them, well, tangible, in a way a physical lab just can't. And then there's the whole self-paced learning thing. It puts the student in control. If you don't get something, no problem. You can just rewind the experiment and do it again and again, as many times as you need. You can pause. You can really think about each step. That's a luxury you just don't get in a busy classroom where everyone's moving at the same speed.
Okay, but let's be real, no tool is perfect. For a fair look at this, we have to ask, what are the downsides? It's really important to talk about the limitations too.
So the biggest drawback that the research points to is a drop in that face-to-face interaction. Students get less direct time with their teachers and with each other. A lot of the communication becomes indirect, and that can kind of mess with the whole social, collaborative vibe that's such a big part of working together in a traditional lab. So you've got these pros, you've got these cons. How does a teacher or a school actually decide if virtual labs are the right move? Well, the cool thing is the research gives us a really clear framework for figuring that out for yourself. It's basically using the scientific method on teaching. It's pretty straightforward. First, you figure out your goals and you split your students into two groups. Then, you give everyone a pretest to see where they're at. Step 3, one group uses the virtual lab while you observe. Step 4, you give everyone a post-test to measure what they've learned. And finally, you analyze everything, compare the results, and you'll have your answer. It's a really solid way to see what's actually working.
All right, so let's zoom out and put all these pieces together. What does this all mean for the science class of tomorrow? Where is this all heading?
I think the takeaway here is pretty clear. The evidence shows that virtual labs aren't just a convenient backup plan. No way. They are a genuinely powerful tool that can actually, measurably, improve how students perform. And maybe even more important, they can deepen their understanding of how science really works.
And that leaves us with one last big question to think about. As this tech gets better and better and cheaper and ends up in everyone's hands, what will discovery itself look like when pretty much anyone, anywhere on the planet, can have a whole laboratory right in their pocket?